Ecology at Laurentian University, and this is the first event from the newly created Center for Evolutionary Ecology and Ethical Conservation. It's Thinking Extinction, which is a symposium on the philosophy and science of endangered species conservation. We've had a couple of very interesting days, and I have made a note here. I said sometimes bewildering, but always interesting and wonderful. Listening to the great talks from various philosophers and scientists from across Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia. It's a pleasure today to introduce our plenary speaker, Dr. Stuart Pimm, who is here as Doris Duke Professor of Conservation Ecology from the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University in North Carolina. He is been awarded the Heineken Prize for Environmental Sciences, which is the equivalent of, I guess, the Nobel Prize, a very wonderful honor for him. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's won the Edward T. Larrow III Memorial Award from the Society of Conservation Biology, the Marsh Prize of the Zoological Society of London, and the list of awards goes on and on. He's been called to testify as an expert witness in front of the U.S. Congress on conservation issues, and he conducts research on species conservation and extinctions, focusing predominantly on tropics and other species hotspots, or biodiversity hotspots. He leads something that's called the Pimm Group, which is a collection of his students and former postdocs and former students that engage in this kind of very important conservation work. And he's here today to speak to us about extinctions, when, where, how fast, and what we can do to stop them. Dr. Pimm, you can begin, please.
Thank you so much for coming and listening to me tonight. It's always a great thrill to come to Canada. I genuinely love Canada. It's a country that greatly challenges and offends the United States. People in the United States do not want to be reminded that after the unpleasantness of 1776, 100,000 people clearly who do not want to become free migrated to Canada, that you count all the votes in a general election, and that you have universal health care. These are notions that we find to be entirely disruptive and un-American. The fact that you occasionally have pictures of the Queen on your buildings does not cause me any harm whatsoever. Had Al Gore indeed counted all the votes in the election and become president, then I could have said that as such, he famously said that species are going extinct 1,000 times faster than they should be. If you wondered from whom he got that, the answer is me, although I have to tell you that in an inconvenient truth, he wasn't exactly forthright in telling you that. So what I want to do tonight is to talk about species extinctions. It's the kind of subject that if you are not careful, you will go away feeling truly dreadful and awful, and if you're in a tall building, you might want to throw yourself out of it. I hope I can convince you that there is considerable room for optimism, that there are wonderful young men and women and conservation professionals around the world who are doing an extraordinary job to make sure that species don't go extinct, that we pass on to our our children, our grandchildren, the kind of rich and diverse planet that we inherited from our grandparents. I will end talking about sin. And I happened to notice that on the wall that said, "What does God require from us?" And in a very deep way, I think God expects us, as St. John said, you know, God so loved the world. It's actually God so loved the cosmos in the original. And as a Christian, I think we should love, you know, the world, the cosmos too. And I shall end very much on that theme. So, what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about what's wrong with the planet, and I'm going to not spend a lot of time talking about that. We all understand that, you know, the planet could end up as a seriously awful place. And since I've had the privilege of having Margaret Atwood as my warm-up act, I perhaps don't need to dwell on that. You know, if you look at her speculative fiction, you can imagine how beastly the planet might be if we screw things up. There are some things I'm not going to talk about, and I'm not going to talk about them because, frankly, Canadians know a lot more about the subject than I do. One of them is this graph, and I promise you this is the most complicated graphic item I will show you. It's by two of my long-term friends and colleagues, the late Rand Myers and Boris Vaughan, both of Dalhousie, who looked at how many fish were being caught on so many hundreds of hooks by the Japanese fishing fleet. These are top predatory fish. These are swordfish and billfish and big tuna. And as the Japanese fishing fleet started getting underway just after the Second World War, they were catching sometimes as many as 10 fish per 100 hooks. By the time they geared up in 1958, across the world's tropical oceans, routinely they caught, you know, 10 fish per 100 hooks. By 1964, there were just a few places left where fishing was that good. And by 1980, they had simply fished out the top predators in the oceans. We know from this work, this largely Canadian work, of parallel studies done by my friend Dan Pauly of UBC, we know that we have eliminated, we've almost exterminated the top predators on the oceans. I don't want to talk about this. We've got perfectly good, wonderfully competent Canadian scientists to talk about that, and I don't need to pursue it any further. Nor am I going to talk about the Arctic. This is again a subject of considerable concern for those of us who study extinctions. You know, will the polar bear, the muskox, the walrus, ivory gulls and the rest, will these species survive? I'm not going to talk about that. It's not an area I know well, but it would be inappropriate for me to just pretend that doesn't exist. What I want to talk about are two themes which connect the boreal forests and the tropical forests. Places which you know and I know, and I want to talk about what's going on there, what's wrong, and what can we do about what's going on there to prevent species from going extinct. Forests connect biodiversity and connect what we're doing to forests, because, as I shall argue, the destruction of forests is a major contributor to global warming. What John Holdren, the US science advisor, calls climate disruption, the notion that it's some slow, gentle warming, is nonsense. It's complicated and it's disruptive, and it has the potential to cause amazingly harmful changes to species and peoples alike. So let's start with the warm, wet places of the world. These are the places that I know best. It was a considerable physiological challenge for me to come here to Sudbury, but I'm up to it. If we look at what's happening to the world's tropical forests, they're going up in smoke. And the extent of those changes contributes 15% of the global carbon emissions. That's more than all cars and trucks put together. That's more than all the European community put together. It's 1.5 billion tons of carbon going into the atmosphere each year. I've always wanted to sound like Carl Sagan, you know, billions and billions of tons. And if we look at the distribution of where forests have been cleared, we see that the tropical forests have suffered an extraordinary amount of clearing. That the forests have gone from coastal Brazil and the northern Amazon and the Caribbean and a variety of other places. Now, this map is quite significant in terms of my career. As you've heard, I've been enormously fortunate to win some of the top international prizes for my field. But during the last Bush administration, I was not put on the list of the 100 most dangerous academics in the United States. I was hurt. I was wounded. So I have been thinking about how I might rectify that omission. Talking nicely about Canada certainly helps. But this map is a subversive map. If you look at this map, you will notice that, well, Greenland looks quite tiny. Canada actually looks a lot smaller than you thought it might be. South America looks quite large. Africa looks huge. This is clearly the wrong map. This is not the map that Secretary of State has behind him when he gives briefings at the State Department, the map that is due to Mercator. It's a map, incidentally, that explains why Americans are nervous about Canada, because you look so huge on the Mercator projection. It's clearly why we spend so much money on defense. We were afraid you might, invade and bring parliamentary democracy to us, which would be awful. The fact is, this is an equal area projection. It shows the planet in terms of where the area is. And it's important we understand that so we see how big the world's tropical forests are. We ought to have some sense of where they are, how big they are, and how much of them have been destroyed. This is a close-up of what's happened to Brazil, and I'm going to be talking a lot about Brazil. There's still a lot of the Amazon, that's the green stuff, but there's an awful lot of places in the Americas, in coastal Brazil, the northern Andes, the Caribbean, where we have destroyed tropical forests. And if we're going to understand extinction, we have to make that part of our discussion. That's Dipterocarp forest in Borneo being logged. This is an oil palm harvest being taken to a plant. There's a fairly efficient program apparently that collects oil palm from small growers and takes them to centralized facilities where the oil is extracted. This is a small truck
almost certainly representing some very small grower.
Dangerous.
Increasingly, areas of tropical forest in Southeast Asia and now in the Amazon are being cleared for oil palm, but large areas of tropical forest are being cleared for really no other reason than if you clear the forest, you tend to get title of their land. Clearing and burning tropical forest is a major cause of greenhouse gases, and it's a major cause of species extinction. But if we're going to talk carbon, we also have to talk about the boreal forest too. I'm a member of the Pew Foundation's International Boreal Forest Conservation Campaign. I think the main reason that they invited me is that I'm a tropical forest biologist, and they thought, you know, if they can convince me that the boreal forest is important, it will add credence to their arguments, and I did so with enthusiasm. The boreal forest is hugely important in terms of understanding our global impacts. I joined with Andrew Weaver, who is now a Green Member of Parliament for the British Columbia Legislature. He's a professor at the University of Victoria, and Nigel Roulet, who is at McGill, in a statement that says we've got to think about the boreal forest in terms of how much carbon it's got. You guys have an awful lot of carbon. You actually have more carbon than the tropical rainforests have. It's not that it's in the trees, it's in the soils, it's in the peat. So if we're going to be effective at reducing the carbon emissions that come from our land use changes, we have to be alert to the dangers and the potential solutions that come from thinking about Canada's boreal forests. This is a map. Red means there's a lot of carbon, and blue means there's not so much. There's an amazing amount of carbon up there. And what's going to happen there is going to have, or potentially could have, a massive impact on the world's climate. This image came out, as far as I know, today, and if not today, within the last couple of days. It looks at deforestation globally. This is just a piece of it, since 2000. And I think you can see there's a lot of Canada that's going up into the atmosphere. I think we have to be worried at an international level about the deforestation in Canada and what that means to carbon emissions and what that means to what we're doing to the climate. My second theme is about biodiversity. I just love this map. I discovered it quite recently. It's a very, very famous map. I mean, I didn't discover the map. It's the Valgas-Malamur map. It's the map that, produced by Valgas-Malamur, put the word America on a map for the first time. It's the map that gave us the term America. That's because he didn't realize this Colon chap claimed to have discovered America first. Now, I know this is going to be hard for you to believe, but most Americans think that Christopher Columbus discovered America. Now, we British join with you Canadians. You notice I'm rather flexible about this nationality thing. We British join and know that the person who discovered North America was John Cabot. Not yet. And there is a memorial to John Cabot in Halifax. Okay. And I just love John Cabot. I mean, it's so British, isn't it? It's like Bond, James Bond. Cabot, John Cabot. And his name was?
Giovanni Caboto.
Thank you. But we'll gloss over that for a bit.
So it really ought to have been, Caboto and not America, but, history is history. But on this map, ladies and gentlemen, is a parrot. And it says, in very small print, you have to get a magnifying glass to see it, but it says, Ruba cetacei. I don't speak ancient Italian, but it means, it means a red parrot. It's actually a skull on the core. And what I love about that is on the very map that defines the name of our continent, we have something about the rich biological diversity that the explorers discovered. This is a map of the diversity of birds, and mammals, and amphibians of the New World. And there's no polite way to put this. There are relatively few species where you speak French. There are slightly more where you speak English, a lot more where you speak Spanish, and most more where you speak Portuguese. There are an extraordinary diversity of species in the tropical moist forests. So we have to talk about tropical moist forests if we're going to talk about extinction. So if you look at birds, you can see that the Amazon is teeming with an incredible variety. Red means more species, blue means fewer. Mammals, much the same, amphibians, much the same. But there is another piece to the story about biological diversity. That is, I want you to imagine that we line all the species up, from the smallest to the largest. So over here, we have species with the tiniest geographical ranges, and over here, we have the species with the largest geographical ranges, and we just look at the species with the less than half the median, the 50% of the species that have the smaller ranges. The map on the left is all the species, tons of species in the Amazon. The map on the right has half as many species as the map on the left, but it's the species that have the smallest geographical ranges. If you like, these are Mother Nature's eggs, and she has put them in a very small number of baskets. These are the species that are most vulnerable to extinction. It's much easier to drive a species to extinction if it has a small geographical range than it has a large one. If you destroy, 10,000 square kilometers of forest, if that species has a range, from Victoria to Newfoundland, it will be okay. If it's a species that only occurs on Newfoundland, it might be in trouble. So smallness, small range means vulnerability. And what you see is that there are peculiar distributions of species. Some areas have species with small ranges, some don't. But the places that have many species with small ranges are idiosyncratic, they are special. There are places like the Caribbean, Central America, the Northern Andes, a little strip of forests along the coast of Brazil. That was birds, this was mammals. The details are slightly different, but the general patterns are the same. There are some places where species with small geographical ranges are concentrated. That's a map of global patterns. The Caribbean Central America, the Andes, coastal Brazil, Madagascar, the mountains of East Africa, the eastern Himalayas, islands of Southeast Asia. These are places where an incredible variety of species occur and where an incredible variety of species are at risk of extinction. If you imagine combining in some way that map of where forests have been destroyed with the map of where species have small ranges, it's not surprising that you find for the Americas that the species that are on the verge of extinction are in the northern Andes and the coastal forests of Brazil. Children under 18 should cover their eyes. The tropical forests are where the wild people are too. These are two friends of mine who are Guarani Indians. As you probably gather, they're an enormous amount of fun. These guys are just great, right? And they are dressed in their finest jewelry. Occasionally the Penty on the right insists on wearing a t-shirt that says Harvard on it, and I strongly discourage him. I've given him all sorts of other t-shirts, but he seems to like the Harvard one for some reason I simply cannot understand. That map from my colleague Lisa Manna is a map of where different languages are. Indigenous peoples, the First Nations, that's such a good Canadian term. This is a map of First Nations. This is a map of Indigenous groups, and you can see that very large numbers of them are concentrated in the Amazon. So these are places where we have large numbers of individual societies and cultures who are also vulnerable because they occupy small areas. As it happens, the Guarani occupy a rather large area because these guys always go around with spears, and they're not for ornament. They use their spears because if they don't like people, they kill them. But it's always good to see these guys back. All right, I want to talk about solutions. You know, if there are any Norwegians in the audience, you should get up and we'll all hug you. You're Norwegian? Are you Norwegian? Oh! There is a good reason why you should hug your Norwegian today. A few years ago, Norway decided that it was going to do something about Brazilian deforestation. The image, that satellite image, it's actually a weather satellite image, is about 1,000 kilometers east-west and north-south. It's from 1999, it's from a particular day in 1999 when I flew across the Amazon. It was a day that I couldn't see the forest for the entire way because it was covered in smoke. The whitest cloud, all that brown stuff are smoke plumes. Huge ones. I mean, that smoke plume there is 500 kilometers long. Brazil was burning so much tropical forest that following the US and China, Brazil was the third largest carbon emitter. With help from Norway to combine the excellent science that the Brazilian scientists are capable of doing to monitor where deforestation takes place, with law enforcement, the $1 billion from Norway went to help Brazil enforce the ban on tropical deforestation. Brazil was able to reduce its tropical deforestation by 3/4, by 75%. The figures for this year have just been released. They're not good, they're up a little bit, but nonetheless, this is the second best year for deforestation, i.e. the second lowest year for deforestation in over a decade. Now, we rich nations of the world ought to be doing a lot more to engage tropical countries to help them reduce their deforestation. Indonesia, Colombia, many other countries are still burning large amounts of tropical forest and suitably encouraged, bribed, if you want to put it that way, we ought to be encouraging countries not to be contributing so much to global warming. The second story I want to talk about is that we need to protect more land. We need to prevent forests from going up in smoke. We need to create more, larger, bigger, better national parks. And you know what? We're doing a good job. The Convention on Biological Diversity set as a target for 2010, 10% of the world protected. We actually achieved 13. For 2020, the aspiration is 17%, and we're getting that way. Now, it's not all good news. There are certain kinds of ecosystems that are very poorly protected. Temperate grasslands are very, very poorly protected indeed. And, you know, in Canada, we understand why. These are the prairies. We've either plowed up the prairies or we've converted them to our own domestic livestock. So some ecosystems are poorly protected. But let's look at what's happening in Canada. I want to talk a little bit about this report from my colleagues at Pew on the Boreal forest. And it brings biodiversity home. It brings biodiversity in the context of an iconic species of the Canadian boreal forest, the woodland caribou. This was something like its native range, but we know that its range has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk over the last century. Its current status is such that perhaps only a small fraction of the remaining herds are ecologically viable. If we look at what's happened, you know, we can see that very, very substantial amounts of boreal forest in Canada are under considerable ecological pressure from our human actions. If we're going to save a species like this, we have to think of protected areas on a large scale. It's no good imagining a little bit of protected area there and a protected area there and a protected area there. We have to start thinking about setting aside large areas of forest if we're going to, you know, to manage this species, to give it a long-term sustainable future. So, if we look at what the boreal was and is now, we can see that it's shrunk. And it's shrunk particularly in Ontario and Quebec. I showed you a map earlier which looked at forest changes, and we know that in Western Canada, very, very substantial amounts of forest have been logged within the last 20 years or so. There are massive claims for mining. That's one of the, oh my God, isn't it awful, we should, you know, all go away and, you know, cry in our beer. But the story I'm going to tell you is that Ontario and Quebec have done a really quite extraordinary job of becoming concerned and doing something practical about protecting the boreal forests. Now, you're probably saying it's not as optimistic, it's not as rosy as I'm saying. By any kind of global standards, it's a pretty impressive commitment. In 2007, I was one of a number of scientists who organized a large number of other scientists around the world to say, let's get some serious protection. I suspect many of you in this room signed this letter. You know more about this subject than I do, but you know the way the politics works. It's sometimes useful for a bunch of foreigners, you know, people like me, English or American, depending on what you want to accuse me of being, to interfere. And since then, you'll notice, incidentally, that this is produced by an American organization because it talks about acres. I think there are 2 acres to a hectare, which is a measure of how poorly I've adapted to America, but divide by 2 to get to hectares, okay? And Ontario has committed to protecting substantial portions of the boreal forest, 110 million acres. Half of it is supposed to be becoming new parks, and Quebec has promised a similar kind of thing. Now look, we all understand political promises. The nature of political promises are not different on either side of the border, or indeed on either side of the Atlantic. Nonetheless, this is some measure that Canadians have begun to think about these terms of protecting the boreal forest, doing something about them, and making commitments which we hope we can hold the politicians' feet to the fire. So that's what appears to be set aside. Big promises in Ontario and Quebec. Western Canada is, well, I don't need to tell you about Western Canada. My next story takes us to another continent. I want to talk about Africa. And I want to talk about the issues of how Africa's large national parks are really not large enough. You know, you all have visions of Africa from National Geographic specials. You know, you imagine Africa as being a place, ladies, where you wear khaki, have a big floppy hat, and you say, I have a house in Africa at the base of the Ngong Hills. And you imagine, if you're old enough, having Robert Redford as a boyfriend.
Who will save our lions? In Africa, as farmland consumes savanna and cattle herds displace native animals, lions are making their last stand. With few remaining prey options, desperate lions attack livestock, forcing impoverished herdsmen to retaliate. In this conflict, lions always lose. It takes a passionate, dedicated group of conservationists to turn poachers into protectors. Without these conservationists, wild lions will soon be gone, confined to tourist parks and hunting reserves. The Big Cats initiative of the National Geographic Society intends to halt global lion decline by 2015. It supports promising local conservationists and programs that deliver big results. Major grants, Big Cats Week, and the Pause and Uproar campaign all support one goal: to safeguard and restore big cat populations and the ecosystems they inhabit. There are many reasons that the Big Cats Initiative wants to save lions. Lions are the top predator, helping to control populations of other animals. They shape their entire ecosystem. Lions attract thousands of tourists every year to the countries that protect them. The Maasai tribes in Kenya, the Sinhalese in Sri Lanka, and New Year's revelers in China, lions play a central role in traditional rituals. They are part of our ecological, economic, and cultural lives. In the mid-1800s, 1.2 million lions hunted their prey across habitat that spanned Africa, the Middle East, and India. But by the year 2000, lion populations had dwindled to a fraction of their former size and vanished from 18 countries. Today, fewer than 35,000 lions remain across sub-Saharan Africa and India. Africa's human population will grow by 20 million people this year. People clear land for agriculture and livestock, destroying habitat and eliminating prey. Prey species are also the targets of poaching and the bushmeat trade. In many areas, lions cannot find wild prey to attack. Domestic animals, on the other hand, are plentiful. Without sufficient natural prey, lions will hunt and kill valuable livestock. In return, herdsmen hunt and kill lions. Ultimately, the survival of lions depends on the cooperation of local communities who must live with lions every day. That cooperation depends on the work of Africa's best and brightest. The Big Cats Initiative funds the people who show that communities and lions can live and prosper together. Through this series of videos, you'll meet some of these heroes and learn how their innovative ideas are saving the lions of Africa.
Quite simply, Africa's national parks, though large, are not big enough because their wildlife needs to spread beyond the park boundaries. When predators go beyond the park boundaries and kill domestic livestock, people naturally retaliate. So I want to share a short video clip about a couple of the projects that we at the Big Cats Initiative have been funding. These are all the different projects. We've funded projects from South Africa, north through Kenya, and west to Cameroon. We're funding a whole variety of different grantees at the moment. But I can give you a feel by giving you an example of just a couple of them.
Well, cheers. I'm sitting in a hut in north central Tanzania. I believe this is the first wife's hut. It's certainly a very nice and comfortable surroundings, and I'm having a lovely cup of tea, which I'm told has some other potions added in the way of bark, which is clearly going to keep me young and handsome forever. And we're here visiting Dr. Lily Lichtenfeld and her team. This is a project funded by National Geographic's Big Cats Initiative to try and stem the decline of lions. We're in an area that is outside of a national park, but near a national park. And the reason that lions decline here is that lions come in at night and kill people's cattle, and cattle and goats are people's wealth. And not surprisingly, when this happens, they retaliate and go and kill the lions. Sometimes they poison the lions. And how can we stop that? Well, the simplest way to stop it is to make sure that the lions can't get in and kill the cattle. And so what Lally and her team have been doing is to create hardened, fortified bomas. And they do that with an intriguing blend of traditional fencing, live fencing materials that are spiny and bushy, so you can weave the bushes into the modern piece of technology, which is a chain link fence. So that's what we're going to go and take a look at.
Hi, I am Dr. Layli Lichtenfeld. I'm the Executive Director of the African People and Wildlife Fund.
First of all, let me congratulate Layli for your grant from National Geographic under the Big Cats Initiative. I mean, this is very impressive, Alali. I mean, it's very prickly and it's very thick.
Thank you.
And
what we're happy to see is that this living wall has not been in for that long, and we're already seeing very good growth of the Commiphora africana, starting to weave the thorn back into the chain link, so that over the years, as this continues to grow, it will actually create an impenetrable barrier, and the lions won't be able to see the cattle won't be able to see the lions, and we'll have reduced the panic that ensues when the cattle smell the lions, see the lions, they try to break out of the corrals, and that's one of the things that we're trying to prevent.
I'm talking to Anne Kent-Taylor, and she is standing next to a boma. You tell us why this is special and what you've been doing with this program.
The program has been set up primarily to prevent predation of livestock and then the resultant killings, particularly of lions, but also the other big predators. This particular boma belongs to Saitoti, who's a member of my desnaring team, and he was the first person to put up the protection we provide. You can see inside there was already protection, but lions penetrated it, and he had lost many cattle to predation. So we brought in 8-foot chain link fence and put it around the original boma. You bury it 2 feet to prevent any animals from digging underneath, particularly with the goat and sheep sheds. The honey badgers like to dig under, and then they destroy the goats, particularly the little lambs. And they can take 40 in a night with no problem whatsoever. He's planted kai apple, which is prickly, and it will prevent any sort of predation.
You tell me what happened here.
This is a boma where last week it got raided by, first of all, a honey badger, then a hyena, and then a leopard. And they lost, I think it was 30 sheep and goats. And tomorrow we will be bringing chain link fence to fortify it to prevent any further predation.
The point of these stories are that if you engage with local communities...
Thank you so much.
And Anne and Layli live in these communities. There are a lot of things we can do, a lot of things we can achieve to ensure that people benefit from the wildlife protection, they benefit from the national parks. I promised you that I would talk about sin. My children, you have sinned.
I've sinned.
You have sinned, my son. You have just admitted. I can save you from sin. I can save you by selling you an indulgence. I'm in the business of selling carbon indulgences. You are all sinning to the tune of about 6 tons of carbon per year. I know you travel a lot internationally. Tom, for you, you have a greater sin.
The greatest species diversity is found in the tropical moist forests of the world, and bird species are an example of this, with high concentrations of birds in the Amazon, tropical Africa, Southeast Asia. The greatest number of threatened species, however, is where geographical small ranges collide with excessive deforestation. A good example of this is the coastal forests of Brazil. We can map out in some considerable detail where those species are likely to live. This particular image plots the remaining forest against elevation and color codes the image by how many threatened species remain in these places. All of these images are courtesy of my colleague Clinton Jenkins. If we want to understand why there are so many threatened species here, one can look at the remote sensing. This is a landscape that is extraordinarily fragmented. These patches of forest, tiny and isolated, contain the largest number of threatened species in the Americas. The obvious question is what we can do about this. When faced with these images, I felt that everything we know about the loss of biodiversity from fragments suggests that the most effective conservation action would be to reconnect those fragments. As we close in on this image, the quality of the grazing land here is all too obvious. You can see the brown lateritic soils shining through. This is extremely bad land. Bad land, of course, means that it's cheap to purchase. It can grow carbon cheaper than it can grow cattle. The need to reconnect these patches is not just limited to birds. The area on the right is Hebio Unial, a nature reserve, and it's the home to the golden lion tamarin, a charismatic little monkey that has been rescued from the very brink of extinction. The tamarins want to go forth and multiply, and to do that they have to cross this gap. And what you're seeing now is how this gap has changed in the years since my group, Saving Species, purchased the land. You can see that that gap is becoming greener. In this image, it's quite clearly a lot greener than it was historically. And that's because we have removed the cattle from this area. We've planted trees, we've restored the land, and the forest is beginning to come back. So who is the we? My organisation, savingspecies.org, raised the money. We gave that money to a Brazilian NGO, the Golden Lion Tamarin Association, who bought the land and then handed that land over to the Instituto Chica Mendes, essentially the Brazilian Park Service. The Tamarin Association is also doing these plantings, so you can see the forest coming back at really quite a remarkable rate.
Yes, we use child labor. Here they are, being videotaped by the local TV station as they plant trees. This is a landscape that once was massively fragmented. We are connecting, protecting, restoring, CPR for Earth, bringing back the connections.
We have not just merely destroyed so much of the world's tropical forests. What we have left behind is in tatters, in fragments. And those fragments are often too small for species to maintain viable populations. There just aren't enough males to go around for the females and females to go around for the males. And of all the places, of all the fragments, one that I thought was particularly tragic was the one immediately behind me. This is the Union Biological Reserve in coastal Brazil, about 100 miles east of the city of Rio de Janeiro. Because in this isolated patch of forest are a whole load of species on the brink of extinction, the most charismatic of which is a beautiful little monkey called the golden lion tamarin. And the golden lion tamarins in that fragment could not go forth and multiply into the forest over there because there was the cattle pasture behind me.
And when I saw that cattle pasture for the first time about 8 years ago, a cattle pasture just like the one I'm standing in, I thought, it has to go. And so we have made it go away. This is a restored forest. I helped raise money for my friends at the Asociación Mica León Dorado, the Golden Lion Tamarin Association. I've planted this forest, and it now connects that once isolated fragment of forest in the Union Biological Reserve to a much larger area of forest over in this direction. It's what we call a biological corridor, and it means that the golden line tamarins that were once imprisoned in this forest island, this forest fragment behind me, can now cross through these small but growing trees and go and find new habitats, new homes, new places for their tamarin families.
That's what it used to look like. That's what it looks like now.
This holiday season, think of carbon in the most beautiful form. Diamonds are beautiful, but this year, think of giving her some carbon that's even more valuable. Sequester her carbon in tropical rainforest. For very little money, you can offset your carbon footprint by restoring key habitats in some of the most biologically diverse areas of the world. Visit SatanSpecies.org.
And of course, while you're doing so, you can offset your carbon, you can absolve your carbon sin. We have a spectacularly beautiful planet. We are doing some pretty awful things to it. You are used to hearing stories about how bad things are. I hope the 4 stories I've told you, including one that's an achievement that you have made possible in Canada, will inspire you to recognize that we can make a difference, that we can ensure that our children and grandchildren have the same wonderful planet, diverse and rich, full of species that we inherited from our ancestors. Thank you so much. Questions? I hope there's time for questions.
Please.
Questions? Yes.
Right now in this province, we're hoping that the ring of fire will re-energize our economy to go with the ring of fire.
I don't know enough about the ring of fire.
Well, it's going to invade the Boreal and part of the permafrost zone, the southern edge of the permafrost in Ontario. And it's a trade-off. Where do we balance economy, money, and the planet? How do we do this well?
While I can't answer that in any specific detail, because I just don't know, I think what we have to impose upon our politicians is a longer-term understanding than they are used to from their thinking that they have to simply fight the next election. Last week, I was on Cape Horn, the very bottom end of South America. And a few days earlier, I'd been watching whales, right whales, southern right whales. We basically harvested southern right whales to the brink of extinction, and we came perilously close to harvesting northern right whales to extinction. And now the whaling industry is vastly more valuable than it ever was. And the current whaling industry involves people going and taking photographs of them. So as we plan for our economic and environmental futures, I think we have to be cognizant of
of what the longer term opportunities are. I understand that politicians must worry about jobs, about short-term economic gain, but let's at least engage them and not sacrifice our environment for a short-term gain and harm ourselves in the long term.
Any other questions?
Yes.
In your perspective, what's a greater threat to biodiversity, climate change or deforestation?
It's a very, very good question. And I don't think scientists yet have a particularly good handle on it. The critical issue is you can't die twice. So if you're wiped out by habitat destruction, you can't also be wiped out by climate change, basically. So what we've been looking at is, are the species threatened by climate change threatened by habitat destruction, or are they separate sets of species? And by and large, they seem to be separate sets of species. So if you think about what's happening in Canada, species in the Arctic and in the Boreal are not particularly threatened with deforestation, but they're surely by climate change. Species on mountaintops in the tropics are threatened by climate change. Species in the lowlands are threatened by habitat destruction. So there are different sets of species. Do we have a good estimate of how many species are at risk from habitat destruction? Yes. Do we have a good estimate of how many species are threatened with climate change? No. It's a great question because we're still very, very actively engaged in that. But we have to take care of both issues. We cannot have massive tropical deforestation. Canada is sitting on top of, the biggest carbon massive climatic changes. We need to be able to solve all of those issues.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was just wondering, one of your points was making national parks in Africa bigger. And I was just wondering what the strategy was behind that, given that there are so many communities that live on the borders of national parks.
I actually didn't say I wanted to make them bigger. I wanted to make them work. But thank you for the question. The issue is well illustrated by Tarangire National Park, which is where I filmed that clip. The park was set up, as you might imagine, by the British in the last days of empire. They set it up around a wetland because that's where the animals are in the dry season. And they rather ignored the fact that those animals wander across a landscape 4 times as large in the wet season. So if the park is going to work, if we're going to make the park work, we have to find a way of engaging the local communities. And they're not going to be engaged if they lose their livelihoods. And livestock and everything, not once, not twice, but 3 times, have my graduate students have I been approached to sell my graduate students into marriage. And most of my graduate students are women. And I want to assure you that if you were my graduate student, you would be quite safe because I would demand a very high bride price. that I have never ever found anybody yet who has come up with a sufficiently large number of cattle. Okay? I have an African-American student who was offered a very large number of cattle, but I argued that she was very special and she was very talented, and I wanted more cows, and eventually the poor chap wasn't able to meet the asking price. This is serious stuff. I do not mean to make light of it. If all your wealth and your chances of wedded bliss depend upon your cattle, you don't want a lion killing it, right? So what we have to do is ensure that people gain a benefit from the national parks around them. I work just outside of a national park in Madagascar, where people are desperately poor. We have helped that community build a restaurant. It is the best restaurant within 80 miles. It is the only restaurant within 80 miles. But now people who come to the national park come to a restaurant to get a meal. And because of that, all the children are now in school. For a long time, they wore Duke University Nicholas School t-shirts as their school uniforms. You have to take what you get. And those people now understand why it's a good thing to have a national park. You have to engage. Conservation, like politics, is local. Conservation, like parenting, 95% of it is turning up. You cannot do conservation by sitting on your arse in an air-conditioned room inside the Washington, D.C. Beltway. You have to get out there and engage. And it's all a matter of engaging local communities. Yes?
So in that vein, how do you see the role of ex-situ conservation, or in particular captive breeding in zoos?
I think zoos play a very important role in a couple of ways. One of them is it's the way that most people see spectacular wildlife. And I'm all for engaging that. I'm increasingly engaged in China now. Until about a year ago, I was very suspicious of panda conservation. You know, panda politics. Every zoo has to have a panda. And then I went out to Sichuan this year and spent a month traveling around national parks in Sichuan and neighboring areas, and realized that the Chinese have set aside a huge amount of Sichuan as national parks because they realize they need to protect pandas. And so, you know, all those zoos and pandas, and you think, you know, what good are they? And they cost, you know, $500,000 a piece. They engage the Chinese. They make the Chinese concerned about their own pandas. So the idea that the animals are out there and we should do something about them is one reason. And the second thing is that there are really vital programs that breed animals in captivity and then put them back. It's not easy, but you look at, I was hearing today about the story of the black-footed ferret in Toronto Zoo and putting back into the wild. Those are great stories. Anytime you can heal, anytime you can put back, it's such an inspiration.
Okay, some more questions.
One more. Those lions that you showed, I just didn't understand how to solve the lions issue. Can you maybe clarify how lions survive that kind of constellation when there's fences that limit their access to food?
Yeah, I mean, basically what happens is that there are these protected things that the Africans built called bomas. And they're made of bushes. And lions are really smart. So a couple of the sisters stand on one end of the boma and go roar. And the cattle stampede out of the boma. And the other two sisters grab a lion and have some very rare beef for dinner. And if you are the livestock owner, and those lions were what you were going to pay for your bride with, you are cross. So you go and kill the lion. If you build a boma and you reinforce it so the lions can't get in, and especially so the cattle can't get out. Sorry? Well, they eat wildlife, which is what they're supposed to do, zebras and wildebeest and things, right? They don't have to eat domestic livestock. It's that it's an easy meal, right? It's like sort of, you know, you're supposed to stay at home and cook a nice healthy meal and you think, what the hell, I'll go out to a McDonald's. Don't you dare. But, you know, it's that sort of thing. It's an easy meal. Incidentally, one of the really interesting consequences of all this is it's good for marriages. Because, and this is one of the extraordinary things we're learning from this, that you will be happier if you have a good boma, because your husband will not be, your husband will sleep at night. He might do some other things too, but we don't want to go there. But the fact is that he isn't staying up all night worrying about his damn cattle, and he gets a good night's sleep, and therefore he isn't grumpy in the morning. So we're finding that these bomas are an amazing tool for ensuring marital bliss in African villages.
Maybe on that note of marital advice, we'll thank Dr. Pimm for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming.
We're very privileged to have had you come and speak to us about all the great work that you've been doing, so thank you very much.
Thank you.